Hello and welcome to Atlantic Council Front Page, our premier live ideas platform for global leaders who are championing solutions to global challenges. Good afternoon to those watching in North and South America. Good evening to those who are joining in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I am delighted that this week we're joined by World Food Program Executive Director David Beasley, who has an important message to share on the risk of heightened food insecurity and a potential hunger pandemic set to accompany COVID-19. I'm especially pleased to be hosting Governor Beasley, as my home is Charleston, South Carolina, where he was my governor when he led the state in the 1990s. Welcome, Governor Beasley. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
It's great to be with you, and to have two South Carolinians together is really good.
That's right. That's right. So last week on this platform, we were able to host IMF, or International Monetary Fund Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. She joined us to discuss how to address the worst global economic crisis since the Great Depression. So today we're going to focus on how the coronavirus pandemic has heightened the risk of global food insecurity with the potential for a hunger pandemic, as Governor Beasley has put it, which could kill more people than the coronavirus itself. So the Atlantic Council is honored to host Governor Beasley for this discussion about the steps his institution is taking to respond and what others can do to assist. Today's conversation will be moderated by our own Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, and Brahman Bruton, our Director of Programs and Studies in our Africa Center, will provide closing remarks. In response to COVID-19, our Africa Center has led a series of convenings, including most recently with the Director of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The center has also launched a Coronavirus Africa webpage housing expert commentary and analysis, which I'd suggest you bookmark to stay up to date on our content. And as this discussion revolves around food security, we've also been spotlighting our work in the Adrienne Arst Rockefeller Resilience Center that has been focusing on public health challenges, especially in relation to the impact from climate change, been working to build food and water security, and working with partners to serve migrants across the world as part of its goal to reach 1 billion people with resilient solutions by 2030. And finally, our new Geotech Center is focused on harnessing technology to help ensure food security globally. So it's in that context we're really looking forward to today's discussion. As we move into that, I want to encourage everybody who's joined online, they can go ahead and submit their questions using the Q&A function if you've joined us on Zoom. And for those of you following across our social media platforms, you can join the conversation, submit your questions using the hashtag ACFrontPage and the hashtag StrongerAgainstHunger. With that, over to you, Cameron.
Thank you, Damon. Governor Beasley, it's a great pleasure to host you today for this really important and timely conversation as the fourth installation of the Atlantic Council Front Page series. We're honored to have you join us and talk about what WFP is doing to respond to the manifold threats to lives and livelihoods around the world. I want to just jump right into the conversation today because we don't have too much time with you. And I want to talk about a report that the WFP just released, its 2020 report on global food crises, most of which I think was written probably in 2019 looking forward, but it was already clear at the time that 2020 was going to be one of the most food insecure years on record. We have nearly 80 million people remaining displaced from their homes, either as refugees or IDPs, increasing extreme weather events, macroeconomic shocks, and of course, many unattended civil conflicts around the world. That report noted that at the start of the year, we would have 135 million people food insecure. And then, of course, came the coronavirus, and then in Africa came the desert locusts. So at this time, at this moment when we are marking the end of World War II, you have warned us all that we are reaching the greatest threat since World War II to global food supply chain. You've called it a crisis of biblical proportions. And just a few weeks ago, you briefed the UN Security Council on just how bad this crisis is becoming. Can you start us off by telling us what you told the UN Security Council and how grave is this crisis that we are facing right now?
Yeah, Cameron, it's great. And Damon, thank you. But you're exactly right. When I talked to the United Nations Security Council, Tony Blair had called me about 3 weeks ago right before I was speaking to the council, and just picking my brain, what I was seeing in Africa, what was I seeing in the Middle East, and we talked for about an hour. And I gave him the short, the middle, and the long-term perspective of what we were looking at in terms of economic deterioration, supply chain breakdown. And when I started breaking it down over 3, 6, 9 month period, and then breaking it down per country, because each country can be uniquely different. And so Tony was like, wow, you've got to let the world know how bad this could get with regards to these issues. And so then I made the decision that at the United Nations Security Council, I needed to give a very clear and sober reality check of what we were truly facing out there. Now, what was interesting, back in December, January, and February, before COVID was really on the global scene, I'd already been telling leaders around the world, and especially European leaders, that we were facing, in my opinion, the year 2020 would be the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. And I had the basis for that from the Sahel deterioration, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon economic collapse, along with Sudan, DRC, Ethiopia, Somalia, and anyway, keep on going. And so it was a very difficult time. Then not COVID, but then you had, as you said, Cameron, the desert locust began to hit, and the first wave hit. Now we're looking at the second wave as we speak, which is going to be 20 times greater. And we're talking about over 1 million acres being destroyed over the next few weeks and months. And so that's a whole nother issue of food security. Now, when you mentioned the number 135 million people that I report said were acute food insecure, this is not people going to bed hungry. There are 821 million people, as I told the United Nations Security Council, that go to bed chronically hungry. But acute food insecure, that means you're on the brink of starvation. That's serious stuff. We assist about 100 million people on any given day, week, or month. And out of that 100 million, 30 million get only their food from us. So you can imagine what would happen if the economic deterioration continues, if the supply chain breaks down, we don't have the access. Just do the simple math on the 30 million. You know, you can go a few weeks being exposed to a disease. You can't go 2 weeks without food, much less a month or 2 months. So you could have 150 to 300,000 people dying per day for literally 3 straight months at a minimum if this thing does not get addressed properly. Now, that's before I add the new numbers based on what we see COVID doing to the supply chain, the economic deterioration globally, which will add an additional 130 million people, bringing the total of people that are on the brink of starvation around the world to 265 million people. So this is a serious, serious matter. So we've had about 80,000 people die so far over the 4-5 month period with COVID. Imagine if 200 to 300,000 people start dying per day from starvation because of breakdown of economies, lack of monies, or supply chain breakdown. You can have the money, but can't have access to the food because of supply chain breakdown. And now you also got to begin to evaluate the impact that it's going to have in terms of destabilization, conflict, riots, and protests in areas. You're already seeing some of that in places in Africa. You take a young family, let's say a 23, 25-year-old who's got a family to feed, and this man or woman loses their job, and there's a lockdown, and they have no access to food because they don't have a bank account, they don't have coping capacity. You're going to have, as you already are beginning to have, some serious destabilization taking taking place. And we'll break down these issues in a little bit later with regards to supply chain, border controls, import-export bans, what these mean in terms of the availability of food. School children, there have 1.6 billion children have been out of school for the past couple of months. Out of that, 300 and give or take 70 million receive school meals. Well, millions of those school children only get one meal a day, and that's at the school. So they're losing that. That means their nutritional system, immune system will be very weakened, which makes them very vulnerable to disease, whether it's COVID or any other infection out there. So there's a lot of different issues out there. And let's talk about a few countries as we get into this, like Ethiopia, for example. 50% of their export revenues is tourism. Well, that's gone. South Sudan, 98.8% of their export value is oil. Oil prices have tanked. And so we can break down what does that mean in terms of regions? What does this implicate in terms of food security, starvation? And so we've got to get the economy rolling. We can't break down the supply chain. Otherwise, I think it was Tony Blair that said, more people are going to die from the cure than they will from the disease. But we've got the expertise, in my opinion, from our experience, because we deal in war zones in very complex environments, as you can imagine. When most organizations are leaving in a time like this is when we come in strong and hard. 97% of our people are still on the field, doing what they do best, keeping people alive. And so we're out there in war zones like Yemen and Syria and Somalia and South Sudan, et cetera. And we're the containment mechanism for Ebola. Not many people realize that. And so, and one thing, Cameron, let me add this because not many people know this at all. But we don't deliver just food. We are the humanitarian logistics coordination for all the UN and major humanitarian actors. So right now, for example, we are the ones, because the airline industry is primarily shut down, and particularly in Africa, in moving passengers and or cargo, very, very important cargo right now, like COVID supplies. So we're picking up all that. We need about 965 million over the next 9 months just to address the logistics issues. We're building the hospitals. Right now, we've got 3. We're setting up Abu Dhabi, Accra, Addis Ababa. We're going to be setting up some more, be short-term emergency operations. We've already shipped, I would say, millions of test kits, millions of masks, millions of PPE, gloves, ventilators, gowns, et cetera, to over 130 countries so far. And so we're probably I don't know if we're probably the biggest airline industry operating right now around the world. And so if we weren't there, we couldn't move the doctors, the healthcare professionals, the nurses, and the medical supplies. And fortunately, great donors like the United States, UAE, Germany, and others are stepping up. But I'm assuming, Cameron, let's break down some of the requests and the needs that we see that are critical over the next few months. So I've touched on a lot there to get the ball rolling, because this is not a chicken little the sky is falling situation. This is a real case scenario. If we weren't already where we are, we would already have famine in many countries. If we get the food, if we get the money, we can avert famine. But if we don't, you're going to have famine in many countries around the world. And as I said, famines of biblical proportions, and that is not an exaggeration. I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you, Governor. That was a tour de force of where this is right now.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. I want to dig in on a couple of the points that you made there, specifically with respect to the cure being worse than the disease, because I think what we find in places like the industrialized North, where we have social distancing and people can stay at home for days, weeks, months, even. Many parts of the world don't have that kind of luxury to be able to stay home, not go to jobs, not have savings. There was a report recently issued saying that in Africa, as many as half the people who are social distancing right now will run out of food and money within a week of starting that. So my question to you is, how do you feed someone who's not leaving his house, How does someone pay for food if they're not going to their job? How do you access these populations, both rural and now urban populations, who are faced with the prospect of having to be socially distant?
Cameron, I mean, look, the United States, most sophisticated supply chain on earth. And people were running out of toilet paper, panic buying. Now you're looking at running out of protein. You can imagine if that's happening in the United States, what do you think's happened in Niger or Chad or Ethiopia or wherever the case may be, or Yemen, which is just economic disaster? Many of the people we're talking about don't have coping capacity. You know, you and I, we might lose our job. We've got some money. We got food in the cabinet. We can get by. We got friends. Most of these people are barely making it now. They're on the brink of starvation now. They live day to day. In fact, I've had so many Zimbabweans, and I can go from country to country. They're saying COVID, we're not worried about COVID. We don't know if we're going to eat tomorrow. And of course, we're worried about both. You know, we really, really are. This doesn't need to be COVID versus starvation. We got to handle both right. And if we do it right, we can mitigate against economic deterioration, and we can mitigate against starvation because of supply chain and money. And so we're out there dealing with the issues exactly what you're talking about. And for example, boy, you got some riots right now and protests in Nairobi, a couple areas. It's getting very, very complicated. And we're telling countries, if you're going to do a lockdown in a particular area in a country where the people don't have any coping capacity, they don't have a safety net program, we got to come in advance and pre-position food so that they can literally live. Otherwise, you're going to have destabilization. And the last thing we need right now is destabilization in a variety of countries that could bring, I mean, serious national security interests, not just the Europeans, but also to the Americans, because there are groups out there, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, you know, that are trying, Boko Haram, that are trying to exploit this particular situation. So one of the things that we've already asked our donors is, you know, we're the world's largest humanitarian operation. We last year we raised about $8.3 billion. So, you know, every day, I mean, we're raising money. We're almost 100% voluntary funded. And so money's very important. So we've got pledges already in many ways, but still not near the amount of money we're going to need. I say that because I'm asking donors like the United States and Germany, go ahead and advance us the funds that we were going to be using and getting from you so that we can pre-buy the food and pre-position it in strategic locations so that when the supply chain does break down, we will be able to save lives. But what we're already seeing is the cost of transportation is already starting to go up. Food prices are already beginning to go up. Some are spiking. We're already seeing export bans of like wheat from Russia, Ukraine, or rice bans from Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and maybe another one or two today. But that's what we're facing. So if we can get the food on out there, it will really save a lot of money and a lot of lives, literally. And that's what we're doing as we speak.
Let me ask you about the supply chain, because you brought that up a number of times and we've taken some questions on that. I guess this gets back to the issue of the cure being worse than the disease in some respects, because you've seen one of the global responses has been a shutdown of borders, a shutdown of airports, closing down of commercial air travel, commercial cargo travel. How do you get around that when you are trying to move people and food around the world? Are there new creative ways that you are trying to approach this, or is it just a matter of scaling up?
It's a combination of everything. Good old-fashioned relationship, picking up the phone and saying, "Oh, whoa, you need to understand what you're about to do here." And it's not an isolated incident. I mean, you can imagine people are panicking, people are concerned. So our teams, just in Africa alone, in 54 countries, our teams are on the ground, and time when they hear something about a ban or shut down a port or a distribution point or some type of restriction, we're on top of it immediately. Let me talk to the prime minister. Let me explain. What your intentions are, I understand it, but let me give you the ripple effect that's going to happen, not just in your country, but in the region. And so we're all hands on deck in every way, shape, fashion, or form. And sometimes we'll pick up the phone and call a president of a country next door and say, you got to call your friend, explain what's going to happen. It's not always easy. And then we get the quarantine, like, for example, not to get into the country, we're flying life-saving critical equipment and food. And our plane lands and our crew gets quarantined. I'm like, I can't quarantine my crew. Let them stay right there, but they don't think it through. And I actually literally am on the phone today dealing with 2 countries just on this issue alone. I've got to get personnel in there. I've got to get food in there. I got to get equipment in there. You can't shut that down. You go have protests and riot, anyway, you get it. So it's all hands on deck with regards to supply chain. And if the farmers, if they do a lockdown and say, okay, no planting right now, nobody doing anything. Well, if the farmers can't get the food out of the field to the marketplace, it doesn't impact just our beneficiaries. It impacts the entire rest of the population. And for example, right now, we're looking 9 months down the road. If farmers aren't out there planting, well, next fall, when it's harvest time, you're going to have serious food shortages. We're already looking at serious food shortages right now before COVID for the fall, like, for example, in Sudan because of all the floods. And now with desert locusts just consuming 1 million acres of just planted crops, you can imagine what's going to happen in the fall. So you've got a perfect storm of just extraordinary proportions coming together right now. Back to you, Cameron.
Yeah, no, thank you. Let me touch on something you referenced here, which is your funding stream, because the question that I think has plagued a lot of us right now is, unlike past crises, this is a global crisis. And so all of the countries that you've referenced are in crisis, but so is the United States. And so is most of Europe, right? And so when your donor countries are also crisis countries, how does that affect your ability to fundraise? I mean, the idea of food security in this country has been something that Democrats and Republicans have. It's one of the few areas that Democrats and Republicans have been able to agree on in funding our role, and that's especially true with the WFP. How is your appeal going now that we have this kind of manifold crisis, both at home and abroad?
Yeah, you can imagine if your house is burning down, you're losing everything you've got, and somebody comes to you wants to help a neighbor a mile away, you're like, look, I want to help you, but I got to take care of my own family. So yeah, we're dealing with that. And let me say about the supply chain, and we'll come right back to this issue. World War II was a tough time for the world, but the supply chain didn't break down in World War II, except in war zones. You've got the supply chain right now breaking down all over the world, and the implications are just insurmountable. This is why we've got to be shrewd, smart, as to how we handle and respond to this COVID. It's been quite remarkable in the last 4 weeks. I had COVID. I was laid out for about 3 weeks, but I've been now for about a month. I've been sitting in front of this, MacBook or iPad or whatever it might be, doing just what we're doing with presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers all over the world. I've been in Washington, D.C., for the last 3 weeks, meeting with leaders face to face, actually, social distancing, of course, and because I'm probably the safest person to meet with right now. But here's what's really been interesting is, and a lot of people, read a lot of propaganda. The United States has backed off of their multilateral commitment. I hear that all over the place in the last couple of years. But in fact, and this is not a political statement, but when I arrived at the World Food Program, and I was not a big UN person. I was kind of kicking and screaming coming into this role. I'm like, no, I'm not going to go work for the United Nations. I like to get things done, et cetera. And the World Food Program is a whole different ball game. I mean, they get it done, logistics. I mean, it's an amazing operation. So when I arrived, we were receiving the most money ever from the United States under the Obama administration, about $1.9 billion out of our less than $6 billion budget. Now, that was 3 years ago. Under I say under the Trump administration now, with the Republicans and the Democrats working together, we've received for 2019 $3.4 billion from the United States, about 40% of our funding. In fact, the message that Trump and my Republican and Democrat friends gave to me 2 years ago is that we're not backing down. You go tell our allies like Germany, the UK, that, hey, step up too. Now, like you said, it's been really remarkable to see in Washington where the Republicans and the Democrats seem to go like this. The sun's shining, no, it's raining. It doesn't matter what it is they're fighting. But when it comes to food security and strategic international aid, it's been remarkable to see them coming together. In fact, everyone's concerned about food security. They know if there's destabilization to their neighbors, to the south, to the north, across the Atlantic, they know that means it's a national security interest to the American people. They understand that. And so we are very practical, very factual. Here's what's going to happen if we don't get these funds. Here's what's going to happen if there is destabilization. And so we are concerned, of course, because of you got to take care of your home first. We get that, of course. And the American taxpayers are very generous people. But I think there's no question in my mind we can do both. The United States is asking, what else do you need? Where do we need it strategically? Germany, the EU, the same thing. For example, if Sudan, before COVID, was at a magical crossroads, as you can imagine, if they didn't receive economic a program going forward with stimulus packages and safety net programs, you would have a complete destabilization and you would revert back to something much worse than you had before, which would create an incredible environment for extremist groups to destabilize the Horn, and then, of course, mass migration into Europe for economic destabilization there, as the goals of these extremist groups are. And so far, the leaders are expressing we want to help. We want to do everything we can, but so we'll see how it plays out. I'm asking leaders to prioritize. You don't have enough money to make everybody happy. I mean, right now it needs to be life and death commitments on funding, and not the frills and the things like that. It is a critical point in time right now, because what we're doing is analyzing out and evaluating what we consider to be the hot spots. For example, in Africa, where are the hot spots that you may have the worst scenario that could create destabilization to a government, a region, which can impact, global dynamics. And so anyway, let me throw it back to you, Cameron.
Well, let me pick up on this theme of instability, which you've raised a number of times. And, we think of famine and food insecurity as an effect of conflict. You're also talking about famine and food insecurity as a new driver of conflict, is what it sounds like you're saying, by creating instability in countries. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that kind of circle, both as food as a driver of conflict, and then insecurity as a result of conflict, and how do you see these things linked?
It was interesting. We were able to get the United Nations Security Council, and like Democrats and Republicans are fighting over things. In the Security Council, you got Russia and China over here, and you got everybody else over there, it seems like, and they're never agreeing on anything. We actually were able to bring everybody together on the Security Council last year to say very clearly that food security is vital to the peace and stability of nations around the world. That was a huge admission to what most people would think would be common sense. But I think we always took food for granted, and now we're beginning to realize its implication. And so what you can imagine, when you feed like we do 100 million people, if I fed your family in your neighborhood every day for a year, do you think I would know what's going on in your neighborhood? Oh, yeah. I can tell you what's going on in neighborhoods. And that reason I say that, because we survey millions of people all the time. Number one, by and large, and I mean vastly, people don't want to leave home. I don't care where they are. That's their home. you in North Carolina, I'm South Carolina, Damien was Charleston. We've got the flexibility to fly and go get a job over here, come back home, and that's the American way. But you still don't really want to leave home, your country. That's kind of the way it is. There are exceptions to that, but we find that people are no different anywhere else around the world. They don't want to leave home, but if they don't have food or some degree of peace, they will do what any of us would do to save our little girls, our little boys, our children. They will find it. But here's what's interesting. We did a lot of surveying during the Syrian conflict, and still are. We're feeding about 4.5 million people, and that's going to be bumped up to about 6.5 million people, because we can break that down too. But what we found in Syria, and this was reflective of other countries, people will move 2, 3, 4 times inside their country before they will finally leave. But when they don't have food nor security, they leave. Every 1% increase in food insecurity is a 2% increase in migration. Now, listen to this. If I feed a Syrian in Damascus, it's 50 cents a day. And that's almost double my normal rate, because it's a war zone and logistics are costlier in war zone. In fact, we spend about an extra $1 billion of increased costs just in conflict areas. Now, that same Syrian, if that Syrian decided I can't survive and I can't live, I can't get food nor security, and they leave, and they end up in Berlin or Brussels or London, the humanitarian package for support is 50 to 100 euros. So it costs literally 100 times more not to address root cause. So we've got the data with regards to what you're talking about. When food prices start spiking and food becomes a serious issue, theft, riots, protests, destabilization, and then if there's already political dynamics at work, you can imagine how that gets exploited. So,
well, let me pick up on that, because I think one of the interesting things about the crisis right now, when we think about WFP, I think there's a popular conception of WFP as operating in war zones, operating in refugee camp settings or
right.
IDP camp settings. But right now we're faced with a crisis where in world capitals and capitals all over the world, in very urban and peri-urban environments, you're faced with new famine and food insecurity. Does it change your calculus at all, or your way of doing business to provide services to people in those urban areas versus in a more rural setting or in a more conflict associated setting?
No, this urban issue is a very important issue, because you would think it's normally rural, depressed areas, but this urbanization issue is a critical issue before COVID for a variety of different reasons. But COVID has compacted it because of supply chain. And so if people aren't getting their food and don't have a safety net program, wow, that is just a spark ready to go off right there. And a lot of people, I think, in Western countries are now beginning to appreciate what do you mean by this supply chain? And I think they're beginning to understand this. But in the United States, I mean, just this week, I was talking to leaders in Washington about supply chain breakdown, not just toilet paper and protein, but the issues you face when someone shuts a port down or distribution point just for a week. Holy mackerel, because the supply chain is so smooth. And you get in some of the countries that we're talking about, if that was the week that was when the only food that comes in for that month, and that's what you have a lot of places. It may be the only time that food's coming in for that month. And so you can imagine the implications that will have right there alone. And that is what we're dealing with. Yeah. And so a lot of the leaders are looking to us for guidance from our experience around the world. And we're there to do everything we can while we're continuing to deliver life-saving food, we've got about 35, 40 ships on the open seas right now. I don't know how many aircraft now. We were 100 before this. How many we're leasing by the day. And it's been wonderful to see a lot of the allies come together. I picked up the phone the other day and called Mohammed bin Zayed, the head of UAE, and he's just a great friend. And I said, brother, I need a 747, a 737, a C-130, and a hospital in Abu Dhabi. And he said, you got it. To get that kind of response. And when I talked to the friends in Washington, seeing the Republicans and Democrats, what do you need? What's it going to take? And trying to balance out between obviously protecting America first and helping on the supply chain, for other countries. Anyway, back to you, Cameron.
Thank you. I want to pick up on something you said earlier on in your comments. You've talked a lot about logistics, and I think anybody who's listened to us for the last 30 minutes understands now that WFP is really a logistics organization.
Right.
And I think what people don't realize is that you're not just a logistics organization for food, but you're moving everything that the UN does across the board, right? And so I wanted you to just unpack for us a little bit how you work with other UN agencies and partners within the UN system. So not just moving food, but moving medicine, PPE for WHO, moving things for UNICEF. Explain to us how you function as part of this broader family of UN agencies.
Yeah. When I arrived at the UN, I found there were a lot of people that like to just talk, sit around, just talk and talk and talk and talk. And that's just not my way. I'm like, okay, let's talk about it for a few minutes. Let's go get it done now. And so my goal, my goal, is to put the World Food Program out of business. I want to exit strategy in every country because we've been successful. We're no longer needed. Now, as to the logistics, because we are a get it done operation, we have goals, objectives, and we don't let things get in our way. We're always creative to figure out how we're going to get that food there, how we're going to get that medical supply in that particular area which has been restricted. So we've got that experience. Now we have collaborative teams working with UNICEF, UNHCR, IOM, WHO, especially WHO right now. And so we work these teams, and we have a very, very sophisticated computer system, software integrated, and how do we get the best pricing, the best logistics coordination, and then of course moving the products. We're setting up, for example, now distribution points. We got major distribution points around the world already, but now we're setting up short-term distribution points near major medical suppliers, wherever they may be in the world. And so that's to allow us to move the cargo quickly and cheaper, so we can get it on the big 747s, take it, let's say, to Addis Ababa or Accra, and then break it down into the 737s, smaller aircraft. And so like when WHO, UNICEF, UNHCR says we need this, and because we buy so big and we can buy it cheaper and we can buy it faster, we have a lot of agencies that'll call us, and including countries, that'll call us, say, it'll take us 60 days to do this. It'll be too late. Can you do it now? And we're like, we got it. We'll take care of it. And so like hospitals, we're building hospitals. We're buying what we call temporary tents from a home group out of Norway, Oslo. So we just had, I think, 4 flights, Gavin, 4 flights taking equipment for building a hospital in Accra. One in Addis Ababa right now. We're doing the landscaping as we speak with the bulldozers, and literally within 2.5 more weeks, it's ready to go. Now, WHO's got to get their equipment, their personnel in, but we're going to be ready to go. And that's how we operate. We'll build a hospital in about 3 weeks. We'll get that thing ready because it's critical, that's what we do.
Yeah. Let me ask you, we're about to start running short on time, and I wanted to ask you about some of your new lessons learned from this crisis. And, one of the things that I've seen is some kind of creative responses from WFP in the recent months. You did it recently in Sudan, a wheat swap where you're able to purchase wheat for the government of Sudan, and then they can turn that into bread. They can distribute it. We've also seen increasing uses of direct cash transfers to people, so that they're not just lining up for food, but that they have some agency over their food purchases. Can you talk a little bit about how WFP is trying to incorporate some new ways of doing business to respond to the crisis right now?
Well, most people think we just bring in food, and that's not the case. In fact, if you bring in just food in the wrong context, you can collapse the market for all the other people in the region. And we've seen that happen. So we're very meticulous of our economic analysis to design the best modality. For example, and I could do dozens of examples, but we take food into Syria. In Lebanon, we bring in cash because the Syrian refugees, for example, that are in Lebanon, when I say cash, a credit card. So we've designed, not many people realize we're probably definitely the world's largest user of blockchain technologies with regards to the humanitarian world, but artificial intelligence, satellite imagery, the most sophisticated software operations you can find nowadays. And so in terms of cash-based transfers, we now do over $2 billion in cash-based transfers. So, for example, in Lebanon, so we meet and work with, you can imagine the economic impact that 1 million refugees from Syria into a country as poor as Lebanon is right now, what that does, or in Jordan or wherever it might be. And so in Lebanon, we met with over 500 small mom and pop store owners and gave them the equipment so that the refugees could come in with the credit card. It might be $30 a month, but that keeps people alive. Well, multiply that times 1 million. You got $30 million now being circulated into the local economy, helping on pricing and fluidity, as I say, into the marketplace. In Yemen, if we can go from now, you got to make sure you can get the supplies in supply chain. That's critical. Is if we can get the food in, the commercial side can get the food in. Like in Yemen, if I can go to cash using biometrics, either finger or eye, knowing that it goes to the intended recipient, then I can absolutely take the exchange rate, which has been collapsing left and right in Yemen, and the food pricing, and bring it down, not just for my 12.5 million people that we feed in Yemen alone, but the other 16.5 million. I can drive the food prices down for them so that it helps the other 16.5 million. So we're using cash-based transfers where we can to stimulate market economic opportunity. And we're trying to buy more locally too, so that we can stimulate smallholder farmers. We're now buying about $1 billion worth of commodities and services and goods inside Africa now, stimulating the local economy, training smallholder farmers how to be sustainable, successful, doing what we need to do to create, my opinion, freedom and independence so they don't need outside support. So we've got a lot of creative ways, swapping, doing the things. I don't let no be an answer. If I see something needs to be done, we're like, well, let's break that down and think about it. Next thing you know, you've got a hole for opportunity to do what you need to do.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. We run out of our allotted time, but I have to say, Governor, in the face of such a terrifying and concerning crisis, this has been a really uplifting conversation to hear your enthusiasm for rising to this challenge, and you really are the best example of what Americans can do, especially in the UN system. It's a great honor to have you join us today. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Bronwyn Bruton, who is the director of the Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. And just thank you one more time, Governor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cameron, for moderating that conversation. Governor, I'm not going to lie to you. It was a hard information to hear. And I want to thank you on behalf of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council for joining us today. We are deeply grateful to have this opportunity to amplify your message. And I know that I speak for every person who's watching and all of the people who will watch this conversation when I thank you and the frontline workers at WFP for the tremendous service that you are accomplishing. It is uplifting to hear the ingenuity and the energy that you are bringing to tackling this crisis.
No, thank you.
The last thing that I want to do, please, is to invite everyone who's watching now to join us for AC Front Page next week, when we will be hosting David Rubenstein, of the Carlisle Group. That will be Thursday, 12:30 Eastern Time. Again, Governor, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And please pray for our people out there that are putting their lives on the line every day, because they're dedicated. You remember Scott Pelley in 60 Minutes? We had done a big interview, and he was so moved at the end of the interview. He said, Governor, you got the greatest job on earth. And I said, Scott, I do, but I'm going to say something that's going to break your heart. I don't go to bed thinking about the children we saved. I go to bed weeping over the children we couldn't get to. And so we don't have enough money or access. We have to choose which children eat or don't eat. And Scott said, oh my God, I never thought about that. I said, well, Scott, we don't have a choice. So when people step up and give us the amount of money and the food we need, we can save lives. And it really takes a lot of pressure off of our people who have to make decisions of who eats and don't eat. So thank you so much for helping us get this message out. Very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. We're so honored. Again, we're so honored.
Thank you. Okay, great.